Everyone mocked the British officer who carried a medieval longbow into World War II until the day German troops watched one of their sergeants drop dead without hearing a single shot. Only later did they discover the truth, that the insane man with the bow wasn't relying on strength or accuracy or even luck, but on a weapon so silent, so psychological, that modern soldiers simply weren't prepared to face it. And in that moment, they realized why their rifles, their tactics, even their fear couldn't stop him, because mad Jack Churchill wasn't fighting the war of 1940. He was dragging the battlefield back to a century where men like him never lost. Everyone on the British side had heard the rumors about him by the spring of 1940. Not the heroic kind, nothing like that. More like whispers shared in passing. Have you seen the officer with the bow? Do you? He's bringing a sword to France. A real sword. With that adjutant, he'll get himself killed before the Germans even notice him. Exit. The British Expeditionary Force was collapsing toward the coast, men running from one disaster into the next. But even in all that chaos, this officer stood out because he seemed to be moving against the current. While others ditched equipment to run faster, he carried more. While others hid behind walls, he stepped past them. And while every modern soldier held a rifle or machine gun, he moved with something that belonged to a century no one cared to remember: a longbow. The morning it happened, the fog around the French village of L'Épinette hung low and slow, muffling the noise of a war that had already broken too many units. British officers burned classified papers in roadside ditches. Men sprinted past overturned trucks with nothing but canteens and panic. Artillery thundered miles away. But here, just for a moment, the world felt unnaturally still. Too still. Jack Churchill knelt behind a shattered stone wall, fingers lightly brushing the U-curve of his bow as if reassuring an old friend rather than checking a weapon. He was 33, old enough to know fear, young enough to ignore it. And as the fog shifted, he finally saw the outlines materializing across the field. 5 German soldiers. A patrol. Trained, confident, cautious. The man leading them, the sergeant, moved with the precise rhythm of someone who had survived his share of battles. He scanned hedges and windows with professional patience. He expected resistance. He expected traps. He expected trouble. He did not expect a man with a bow. Churchill's heartbeat didn't race. It didn't need to. He had fired thousands of arrows in tournaments from London to Oslo. He had hit targets through wind, rain, and moving crowds. Competition had drilled calm into him the way drills hammered discipline into infantry. When he raised the bow and drew the string back to his ear, nothing in his posture suggested that this shot was different from any other. But everything about it was because no one in Europe had died to an arrow in a modern war for centuries. Because no German soldier in 1940 trained for the sound that never came. Because no doctrine on earth warned a man to fear what he could not hear. The sergeant stepped forward, cutting the distance to 30 yards. Churchill exhaled. The arrow flew. It sliced through the mist without a whisper, too fast to follow, too silent to reveal its path. One moment, the sergeant was alive, alert, ready, prepared. The next, he folded into himself and collapsed in absolute silence, the impact buried beneath the fog and the shock of every man watching. The patrol froze. They searched for muzzle flashes. They scanned rooftops. They shouted warnings to each other, rifles raised, eyes wide, panic starting to bloom in places their training couldn't reach. But there was nothing to see. No shot, no sound, no explanation that made sense. It was the first time German troops realized something was wrong. Very wrong, because whatever had just killed their sergeant wasn't modern. And that is where the story could have ended: one strange kill in one collapsing corner of France, written off as an accident, forgotten by sunset. But the arrow was only the beginning. For the first time, German soldiers faced the one thing modern warfare had accidentally erased: imagination. Guns frighten you in predictable ways: noise, fire, movement. But a weapon that returns from a dead century? A weapon that kills without announcing itself? A weapon that belongs to stories, not armies? That creates fear, different from any machine. While the patrol tried to understand what had happened, Churchill lowered the bow, not with triumph, but with the strangely calm awareness of a man confirming something he had long suspected, that the battlefield still belonged to those willing to fight on their own terms. Behind him, tens of thousands of British soldiers were racing toward Dunkirk, desperate to survive just one more day. But Churchill stood among the ruins with a weapon no one respected until this moment, because he sensed something these soldiers had forgotten. War is not only fought with firepower. War is fought with psychology, with audacity, with the kind of shock that hits the mind before it hits the body. That silent kill echoed far beyond the mist of Le Panette. It traveled through British platoons as legend, across German units as confusion, and into the halls of military command as a question that no one wanted to say out loud. Who was this man who fought the most mechanized war in history as if he had stepped out of another age? And more importantly, what would he do next? Because the arrow was only proof of concept. The real story of Jack Churchill, Mad Jack, as the world would soon call him, was about to begin. It would take him to beaches where bagpipes drowned out gunfire, to raids where a sword cut through fortified positions, to nights where 42 Germans surrendered to him without a single shot, and to a cage from which he would escape simply because he refused not to. But to understand why one man could bend the rules of modern war, we must rewind not to the battlefield, but to the life that shaped him long before he drew that bow. Long before Jack Churchill loosed that arrow into the fog at Le Panette, long before German troops whispered about the madman with the bow, there were signs, small, almost invisible, that he was never meant to be a soldier of his own century. He was born into a world obsessed with rules, ranks, neat lines, and polished boots. England, in the early 1900s, churned out officers the way factories produced steel, efficient, standardized, predictable. Young men went to Sandhurst to learn how to think the same, march the same, fight the same. The system rewarded discipline, not imagination, conformity, not risk. Jack Churchill walked into that world like a spark tossed into a room full of stored gunpowder. At Sandhurst, he passed his exams and met every requirement. But instructors noticed something different about him, something they couldn't categorize. He didn't seek praise. He didn't fear reprimand. He learned every drill and tactic, but he carried himself with the relaxed ease of someone who believed challenges were not obstacles but invitations. His confidence wasn't arrogance. It was something stranger, something quieter, something steadier. Where other cadets followed rules, Churchill studied the gaps between them. After graduation in 1926, he was sent to Burma, where the jungle swallowed the horizon and discipline mattered less than instinct. That should have tamed him, but it did the opposite. In the suffocating heat and the endless monsoon rains, Churchill discovered something he hadn't realized he'd been missing: the thrill of improvising in chaos. While other officers wilted in the humidity, he picked up the bagpipes, taught himself tunes no one asked him to learn, and played them so loudly in camp that some men suspected he did it just to provoke the snakes into leaving. He learned the bow there too, not as a weapon, but because it interested him, because it required discipline and calm, because it felt ancient and meaningful in a world that was rapidly losing both. And then came the motorcycles. Burmese roads were little more than cracked dirt and tangled roots, and any sane officer rode cautiously. Churchill didn't. He pushed his bike to its limit, thundering across the countryside until the ride became a blur of adrenaline and wind. One night he slammed into a water buffalo around a blind corner. The impact mangled the bike, hurled him into a ditch, and left the buffalo wandering off in mild irritation. Churchill climbed out laughing, brushing off dust, as if the crash had simply confirmed what he already believed. He wasn't fragile, and the world wasn't going to break him easily. But even adventure can become routine. After 10 years of peacetime soldiering, drills and ceremonies drained him. The army wanted uniformity. Churchill wanted challenge. So in 1936, with no bitterness and no drama, he did something almost no one did willingly. He quit. He walked away from the military at the age of 30, leaving behind a stable career because it no longer tested him. He drifted instead. Nairobi journalist, archery competitor, extra in films that needed someone who could convincingly fire an arrow or play the bagpipes. He rode across Burma and India on a motorcycle simply because roads existed and he hadn't ridden them yet. People often mistake eccentricity for aimlessness. Churchill was never aimless. He was sharpening something: discipline, endurance, instinct, independence. He was building a mind that stayed calm under pressure and a spirit that didn't depend on permission to act. When he represented Great Britain at the 1,939 World Archery Championships in Oslo, he didn't dominate. He didn't care. What mattered was the precision, the trance of the draw, the stillness before release, the knowledge that a fraction of a breath meant the difference between hitting and missing. Every shot was a practice in focus so pure it bordered on meditation. He didn't know it then, but this discipline would soon carry him through battles, raids, captivity, and escape attempts that no ordinary soldier could endure. And then, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The world lurched toward war. Armies mobilized. Newspapers screamed headlines in tall black letters. Men scrambled to enlist. Generals dusted off war plans that suddenly felt thin and outdated. Jack Churchill didn't pause. He didn't calculate career choices, safety, or future prospects. He walked straight back into the army as if he'd been waiting for the world to catch up to him. But what he brought with him was something no officer manual had ever anticipated. Yes, he carried his rifle, but next to it lay his Scottish broadsword, a heavy, basket-hilted blade polished to a mirror shine. And slung across his gear was a longbow taller than he was, along with a quiver of arrows. To his fellow officers, this was insanity. To the War Office, it was a problem. To Churchill, it was completely logical. In his mind, war wasn't merely about bullets and barrels. War was psychology. War was fear. War was confusion. War was unpredictability. A rifle kills a man. A sword kills a belief. A bow doesn't just strike, it unsettles. It distorts reality. It reminds the enemy that not everything on the battlefield can be measured by range tables and ballistics. While others prepared for a modern conflict, Churchill prepared for a human one. He believed something the rest of the army had forgotten. A terrified soldier is defeated before the fight even begins. By the time he returned to active duty, France was trembling under the weight of German armor. The British Expeditionary Force braced for a fight they were unprepared to win. Officers whispered that modern warfare had rendered men like Churchill obsolete. But Churchill never believed in obsolescence. He believed in effectiveness. When he strapped the sword to his hip and packed the bow among his gear, he wasn't being dramatic. He was making a statement, a private one, that he would meet the coming storm on his own terms. And, when the storm finally broke over Le Pinet, when 5 Germans moved through the fog and 1 collapsed without a sound, that statement became impossible to ignore. Because every legend begins long before the world recognizes it. Jack Churchill's legend began the first time he refused to fight like anyone else. Now that the world was at war, all that remained was to see what a man like him would do with it. The silent kill at Le Pinet spread through the British lines faster than any order, rumor, or radio message. Men fighting for their lives don't waste time gossiping. But the story of a German sergeant dropping dead without a sound, without a shot, was too strange to ignore. Some claimed it was a trick. Others swore it was luck. A few whispered that the officer who did it wasn't playing by the rules of the century. But for Jack Churchill, there was no time to enjoy the effect. France was falling apart beneath his boots. The German advance tore through the countryside with terrifying precision. Villages that had stood for centuries were now nothing more than smoke and cracked stone. Roads were flooded with desperate civilians fleeing with carts piled higher than sense allowed. British columns, once proud and ordered, dissolved into a blur of vehicles, scattered platoons, and exhausted men trying to survive one more hour. The retreat to Dunkirk was not a march, it was a collapse. Jack's company had lost men every day since they entered France. Not to panic, not to confusion, but to the cold efficiency of an army that understood speed better than anyone alive. German armor pressed from the front. Aircraft screamed overhead. Columns were cut apart and scattered. Discipline dissolved into instinct. Officers carried pistols not for battle, but for burning documents before they fell into enemy hands. And yet, in all that chaos, Churchill moved differently. He never hurried. He never panicked. He never gave the impression that the world was ending, even as it very clearly was. Instead, he carried his bow. He carried his sword, and he carried a belief that a man thinking clearly in a storm could still decide its direction. His men followed him not because he was fearless. Fearless men die quickly, but because he seemed to understand fear better than any of them. He sensed its shape, its rhythm. He knew how it spread, and most importantly, he knew how to break it. The morning after the longbow kill, Churchill and what remained of his company were ordered to hold a crossroads leading toward Dunkirk. Hold, in this context, didn't mean winning. It meant slowing the enemy down long enough for other units to escape. It meant buying hours with blood. The crossroads was nothing more than a tangle of hedges, broken farm walls, and a ruined barn with half its roof missing. The fog had thinned into a weak gray haze, revealing miles of empty fields beyond. Somewhere out there, German infantry would soon appear. His men dug shallow positions, stacking rubble and overturned carts for cover. Their faces were pale with exhaustion. They had been running for days. Some hadn't slept in more than 40 hours. A few carried rifles without bolts. They'd lost them while scrambling through ditches in the night. But when Churchill walked the line, something happened. Backs straightened, hands steadied, breathing slowed. Not because he told them to be brave. He didn't give speeches. He didn't promise rescue. He didn't even mention victory. He simply behaved like a man who expected the next hour to belong to them rather than the enemy. When the Germans finally arrived, they came in force. First came the distant growl of engines. Then the harsh rhythm of boots, a sound that carried across fields with surgical precision. A platoon moved toward the barn. Another pushed along the hedgerow. A machine gun team set up in a fold of ground that gave them a devastating angle. Churchill studied it all with the cool detachment of a man who had spent years watching arrow trajectories in the wind. He did not reach for the longbow this time. That shot required stillness, surprise, control. This moment required chaos. He drew his sword. The blade caught what little sunlight there was, gleaming like something that had no business existing in the year 1940. His men saw it and blinked, unsure whether they should be reassured or alarmed. But they did not look away. A German burst of automatic fire tore through the barn wall. Splinters exploded across the ground. The British ducked, except Churchill. He stood in the open, sword raised, studying the muzzle flashes like they were simply variables in a problem he intended to solve. "On me," he said quietly. They moved, because of course they did. Even a handful of men will follow someone who behaves like the world hasn't beaten him yet. Churchill led a flanking rush along the hedgerow, moving with a speed no one his age had any right to possess. Machine gun fire chewed the leaves inches above his head. Bullets cracked through the air like snapping twigs, but Jack didn't slow down. He was not reckless. He was decisive. There is a difference. He reached the German gun team just as they were adjusting their field of fire. The crew looked up too late, and the sight of a British officer charging with a broadsword carved a split second of disbelief into their faces. A second was enough. His men stormed the position behind him, firing in controlled bursts, scattering the defenders with a momentum born not of strength but of shock. This was the thing Churchill understood better than any instructor at Sandhurst ever could. If you break the enemy's mind, you break the enemy. A gun kills a soldier. A sword kills his certainty. By midday, the crossroads had become a graveyard of shattered equipment and churned soil. The British lost men. The Germans lost more. But the impossible had happened. Churchill's tiny, exhausted force had held. Long enough. Just long enough. Behind them, units that would have been encircled slipped through and made for Dunkirk. Trucks roared past, carrying men too tired to notice the officer with the sword standing in the smoke, wiping dust from the blade like he'd merely finished a day's work. When orders finally came to withdraw, Churchill gathered his remaining men and guided them toward the coast. The retreat wasn't triumphant, but it was intact. That alone bordered on miracle. As they moved, soldiers from other units stared not at the sword or the bow, but at the man himself. They had heard the stories. Now they had seen enough to believe them. And war, like fear, spreads fastest through belief. By the time Churchill reached Dunkirk, he was no longer the eccentric officer people joked about. He was something else now, something harder to define. A rumor dressed in a uniform. A ghost from another century. A warning the enemy didn't yet understand. The legend had begun, not because of the weapons he carried, but because of the effect he had on the world around him. And the world had no idea what was coming next. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved the British Army, but it didn't save its pride. The men who returned were alive, nothing more. They came back without weapons, without equipment, without certainty. Britain itself seemed to be hanging by a thread, praying the Channel would be enough to stop what had crushed France in weeks. But out of this despair, a new idea formed, a dangerous one, a desperate one. If Britain couldn't outgun the Germans, it would outthink them. If it couldn't stop the blitzkrieg, it would attack where blitzkrieg couldn't reach. If it couldn't win a conventional war, it would create an unconventional force. And so, the Commandos were born. It wasn't an elite unit at first. It was an experiment. A handful of officers gathered in a small, smoke-filled room, sketching a force that didn't exist, yet small teams that would strike at night, raid coastlines, sabotage infrastructure, disappear before the enemy could respond. They needed men who could fight without rules, adapt without hesitation, and break the psychological spine of any garrison they hit. They needed soldiers who could make the enemy feel hunted. Jack Churchill didn't volunteer because he fit the mold. Jack Churchill volunteered because there was no mold. He arrived in Scotland in late 1940, stepping off the transport into a landscape of jagged mountains and freezing lochs. The training ground looked less like a camp and more like a dare. Wind howled across the ridgelines. Rain fell sideways. Nights froze the earth solid. The instructors weren't gentle, they didn't have time for gentle, and the tasks bordered on punishment. March 30 miles over broken terrain with full equipment. Then do it again the next day. Then climb cliffs in the dark. Then crawl through freezing surf with the tide pounding across your back. Then drill live ammunition so close to your head you could feel the heat of the rounds. Men dropped out. Some quietly. Some with curses. Some with tears they were ashamed to shed. But not Churchill. He was older than most, well into his 30s, but he trained like he had something to prove, not to the instructors, but to himself. He moved up mountains as if gravity didn't apply to him. He fired weapons with a calmness that unnerved the younger volunteers. He marched until others collapsed, then marched more. And always he carried the sword. The instructors questioned it. His fellow trainees whispered about it. Some laughed, until they realized he wasn't joking. One night, during an exercise meant to simulate an ambush, Churchill appeared out of a clump of bushes with the blade drawn, moving so silently that the supervising officer nearly fainted from shock. The man scolded him afterward, of course. But everyone understood the message. If Jack Churchill wanted to reach you, he would. More than his stamina, more than his accuracy, more than his calm under fire, it was his mindset that changed the nature of the training. He didn't see the commando course as a test. He saw it as refinement, like sharpening the edge of a blade that had been in storage for years. Churchill knew something deeply, instinctively, almost brutally true. Modern war made soldiers predictable. Predictability created fear. Fear broke men. But unpredictability broke units. He became a quiet shadow among the recruits, not the loudest, not the strongest, but the one whose presence altered the air around him. His bagpipes echoed across the valleys, drifting through fog at dawn, shocking men awake in ways no whistle or shout ever could. Some of the new recruits thought he was mad. Others thought he was testing them. But those who paid attention began to understand him. Churchill did not carry ancient weapons because he disliked guns. He carried them because he understood the human mind. What frightens a trained soldier? Not bullets, they drill for bullets. Not machines, they study machines. Not explosions, they expect explosions. But a man walking toward you with a naked sword while bullets tear the air around him? A man who charges not with coordination, but with conviction? A man who seems to come not from an army, but from a story? That creates hesitation, and hesitation kills. By late 1941, Churchill's reputation inside the Commandos had transformed from eccentric curiosity to tactical asset. Instructors referred to him as a force multiplier. His name began appearing in planning discussions. Younger men sought him out not to imitate him, but to understand the philosophy behind his decisions. He told them one thing, over and over: fight the man, not the weapon. One in night. Those 5 words shaped the early commando ethos more than any manual. They trained to strike with surprise, to terrify, to overwhelm. Not because they had the biggest guns, but because they were willing to use fear the way others used firepower. By winter, the commandos had taken shape. Lean, aggressive, daring, molded by the harsh Scottish mountains into a spearhead Britain could finally aim at the enemy. Then came the assignment that would test them for the first time. A raid deep into German-held territory. An island fortress in Norway. A coastal garrison stocked with artillery, machine guns, reinforcements, and full confidence that no one would dare come for them. Operation Archery. Jack Churchill requested permission to lead the first wave. He also requested permission to bring his sword and his bow. The commanding officer hesitated. An awkward silence hung in the room. A broadsword on a battlefield? A longbow against bunkers? But the war was desperate. The enemy was confident, and Churchill was Churchill. Permission granted. Preparations began immediately. The men sharpened blades, checked detonators, loaded magazines, and memorized their landing points. Churchill checked his sword, ran his thumb across the edge, tuned his bagpipes, studied maps, until even the lines seemed to breathe. On the night before departure, a young commando approached him. "Sir," he asked, "why the sword?" "If that dows." Churchill didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't offer a cryptic one-liner. He simply said, "Because I intend to meet them at the distance where fear lives." The next morning, the commandos boarded their transport ships and sailed into Arctic darkness. The wind clawed at their faces. The sea hammered the hull. Norway was hours away. And when dawn came, so would the moment when Churchill's legend stepped out of rumor and into reality. The Arctic dawn was barely a suggestion on the horizon when the British ships cut their engines and let the sea carry them the final miles toward the Norwegian coast. Everything else was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the skin, that makes men breathe differently, that reminds even the bravest soldiers that they are crossing a line they cannot retreat from. Inside the landing craft, the commandos waited in the half-light. Some checked their magazines, some wiped condensation off their scopes, some stared at nothing at all, lost in the private territories of fear they would never admit to. And at the bow of the lead craft stood Jack Churchill. His sword hung at his side, steady even in the churning sea. His longbow lay tucked among the equipment, wrapped to protect it from the salt air. But it was the bagpipes under his arm that none of the men could stop glancing at. They had asked him, quietly, days earlier, if he truly intended to play them during the landing. He had only nodded. A nod was enough. The Norwegian island of Vågsøy, target of the raid codenamed Operation Archery, lay ahead, still cloaked in darkness. Beneath that darkness, an entire German garrison waited. Coastal guns, machine gun nests, barracks, and patrols accustomed to the safety of distance. They had never been attacked by a force like this. They didn't believe anyone would dare. They were wrong. The landing crafts advanced through a curtain of smoke dropped by RAF bombers. From the decks of HMS Kenya, salvos of 6-inch shells thundered into the shore batteries, the flashes lighting the coastline in violent, stuttering bursts. An officer beside Churchill muttered, "God help us, eh?" Churchill didn't respond. He lifted the bagpipes, inflated them with a single breath, placed his fingers across the chanter, and waited for the ramp to drop. 0848 hours. The landing ramp slammed into the water with a metallic crash. Spray exploded into the craft. Gunfire sparked from somewhere beyond the smoke. Before any commando could step forward, Jack Churchill walked out into the freezing surf and began to play. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but deliberately, each note of March of the Cameron Men, cutting through the chaos with the strange clarity of something that absolutely should not exist on a battlefield. The commandos behind him felt their throats tighten. Some would later say the sound was insane. Others would say it was inspiring. Most would admit it was both. The Germans, however, had no such reference point. They heard music, bagpipes. Bagpipes on a beach under artillery fire. It made no sense. And when something on a battlefield makes no sense, it becomes terrifying. Rounds cracked over Churchill's head. Torches of tracer fire lanced through the smoke. Machine gun bursts ripped into the surf like claws, but he kept playing, stepping forward as if the sea itself were his parade ground. For a moment, the men behind him forgot everything: fear, pain, exhaustion, even the cold. They had followed him in training because he was decisive. They followed him in France because he was fearless. They followed him now because something deeper had taken hold. If he could walk into hell with music, they could run into fire with him. He finished the tune, gently lowered the pipes, set them on a rock as if placing them on a mantle at home, then drew his sword. "Forward!" he shouted, and the commandos surged behind him. The beach erupted into a storm of motion. Explosions tore apart the shoreline. The air burned with cordite and ice. Men shouted, slipped, rose, pushed forward. Churchill charged first, sword raised, moving so quickly that the German gunners assumed he was a decoy, something no sane man would do unless he were trying to draw fire. But if he was the decoy, the other commandos were the hammer. They hit the German positions with terrifying precision. Grenades into bunkers, Thompson bursts across trenches, bayonets into gaps where rifles couldn't fit. Smoke and fire swallowed the approach as the first line of defenses crumbled. Churchill didn't slow. He vaulted over a low embankment, swung the sword like he was clearing brush, and drove his men up the slope toward the coastal artillery battery. A machine gun nest opened fire, sweeping the hillside with a deadly arc. Churchill pointed with the sword like a conductor directing the final movement of an orchestra, and 2 commandos lobbed grenades into the nest. The explosion sent a plume of earth into the air. Screams followed. Silence followed those. The German commander of the shore battery attempted to reorganize, shouting orders into the confusion. He had never trained for this. His defenses were designed to repel standard infantry, not a blade-wielding officer leading a force that behaved like a storm breaking across the rocks. 10 minutes. That's all it took. 10 minutes to overrun the coastal guns. 10 minutes to scatter a garrison trained to hold for hours. 10 minutes to turn a fortified position into a field of burning metal and shattered timber. Churchill stood at the highest point of Moy Island, breathing hard but steady, the sword glinting with smoke-stained light. Below him, German survivors stumbled out of bunkers in disbelief, hands raised. Some stared at him with the wide, unblinking terror reserved not for soldiers, but for apparitions. The radio crackled. The main assault on the town of South Vosges was faltering. German reinforcements had arrived. Street fighting had erupted. Casualties climbed by the minute. Churchill didn't hesitate. He rounded up the remaining commandos, commandeered a landing craft, and pointed toward the town across the water. "We're going again," he said simply. They went. The landing at Vosges was hell. Snipers fired from attic windows. Machine guns hammered the alleys. Mortars shattered rooftops. Smoke flooded the streets until the air tasted like metal. The commandos were pinned down behind low stone walls and splintered fences. Every advance cost blood. Every corner hid another threat. Churchill arrived into this chaos like a shockwave. He didn't shout orders from cover. He didn't crouch behind debris. He ran openly, recklessly, sword in hand, cutting across the street to reposition his men with the precision of someone who could see the entire battle as clearly as a map. He led a flanking attack down a narrow lane littered with glass and rubble, his boots sliding through debris as bullets chewed apart the walls on either side. His men followed, because following was the only thing that made sense. They hit the Germans from the side. The firing line collapsed. Momentum shifted, and Churchill kept moving, one building at a time, one street at a time, one pocket of resistance after another. He fought like a man intent on restoring something the war had broken, not victory, not territory, but confidence. His presence turned panic into purpose, chaos into direction. By late afternoon, it was over. The town fell. The German garrison was scattered, killed, or captured. Over 100 prisoners were taken. Factories were destroyed. Coastal guns demolished. Documents seized. A message delivered. But the cost was high. British casualties littered the streets, and the surviving commandos had faces hollowed by exhaustion. Churchill's blade was streaked with soot. His bagpipes were charred along one side where a blast had nearly gutted them. And yet he walked through the ruined town square with the gentleness of a man surveying a job he had not merely completed but understood. This raid, A single stroke of daring on a tiny Norwegian island would ripple across Europe. Hitler would rage. The Wehrmacht would reinforce the coast. Fear would spread. And the legend of the sword-carrying commando would grow beyond the reach of any official record, because this raid wasn't about terrain. It wasn't about destroying a few guns. It wasn't even about winning a battle. It was about showing the world that one man, in the right moment, could tilt the balance of fear. And fear, Churchill knew, was the most powerful weapon of all. Operation Archery turned Jack Churchill from an eccentric officer into a battlefield problem the Germans could no longer ignore. Reports began circulating through their ranks. A British officer who plays music under fire. A lunatic who charges with a sword. A man who kills silently with weapons no one trains against. They called him Der verrückte Engländer, the mad Englishman. But the British Army didn't see madness. They saw a man who could lead others through the kind of hell where ordinary leadership collapsed. So, when the Allies planned the invasion of Sicily in 1943, the question wasn't whether Churchill would go. It was where they could use him to break the enemy's confidence fastest. The sun scorched the beaches of southern Sicily as Churchill waded ashore with his men. The Mediterranean wind carried the smell of salt, diesel, and burning villages up the coastline. Italian troops were retreating. German paratroopers were digging in. And the terrain mountains, ravines, tight stone towns neutralized tanks and aircraft, forcing the battle into the one domain where Churchill excelled: close, chaotic, human. He marched with the sword at his hip, the longbow slung across his back, and the bagpipes tucked under his arm like an old friend returning to work. The younger commandos no longer questioned it. They had seen Norway. They had seen the effect. They trusted results over logic. On the second day of the advance inland, Churchill's unit passed through a winding gorge that reeked of heat and tension. The Germans were somewhere ahead, hidden, patient, ready. The cliffs narrowed, the shadows lengthened. A perfect ambush sight. Churchill raised his fist. The column froze. Silence pressed against them so tightly the men could hear their own hearts pounding. Then came the first shot. A single crack from a German rifle, echoing off the stone. A British soldier collapsed. Machine gun fire erupted from the high rocks above the ravine. Bullets churned dust into the air. The commandos dove for cover, pinned between stone and steel. In the chaos, something moved through the ravine with unnatural calm. Jack Churchill. He walked, not ran. Not recklessly, deliberately. He studied the angles of fire, the echoes, the rhythm of the bursts. He wasn't fighting the ambush. He was learning it, mapping it, breaking it down. "Sir," a young commando shouted, "they've pinned the whole column." End quote. Churchill didn't answer. He simply said, "Up, I ged." The men blinked. Up? The cliffs were nearly vertical, but Churchill was already climbing. Hand over hand, using cracks in the stone, hauling himself upward with the confidence of a man who believed gravity was negotiable. Bullets ricocheted inches from him. Dust rained down. Shouts in German echoed above. Halfway up, he stopped climbing and hung by one arm as he drew a grenade with the other. He pulled the pin with his teeth, said nothing, threw it into the nest above. The explosion rocked the cliff. Silence followed. Then screaming, Churchill climbed the remaining distance, crested the ledge, and launched himself at the shocked survivors, with the sword drawn in a gleaming arc. The commandos below saw a blur of steel. They heard a scream, British, not German, echoed with such raw fury that something in their chests ignited. Then came the order. Forward. I have the prize. The ambush broke, not because the Germans were outgunned, because they were unnerved utterly, fundamentally by the sight of a sword-wielding officer climbing through gunfire like a man rejecting the very idea of death. Churchill's men flooded the ridge. The survivors surrendered in seconds. The ravine belonged to the commandos. Sicily fell. Italy became the next target. But the landings at Salerno would be nothing like Sicily. This time the Germans expected them. On the beaches south of Naples, panzer divisions waited with machine guns, mortars, and overlapping fields of fire. The Allies landed into a nightmare of exploding sand, burning vehicles, and bodies washing ashore with the tide. Churchill's unit hit the beach under a storm that shredded entire companies in minutes. He didn't break. He didn't even bend. He moved with the sword out, yelling orders through the smoke, pulling survivors toward cover, reorganizing scattered men into fighting groups. Every time German fire began to crush the line, Churchill appeared shouting, charging, directing, refusing to behave like a man who recognized the danger around him. After 48 hours, the beachhead still held. Barely. Then came the order that would define the battle. Churchill's commandos were to hold the hilltop town of Vitry-sur-Mare. If they lost it, the Germans could pour fire down onto the beach, and if that happened, the entire invasion would collapse. Vitry wasn't a town, it was a fortress. Narrow alleys, terraced houses, ceiling-high stone walls, every rooftop a sniper nest, every corner a choke point. Churchill's men defended it with the resolve of soldiers who knew retreat meant the annihilation of thousands on the beaches below. The Germans counterattacked again and again, infantry, machine gun teams, armored cars probing the defenses. Each wave crashed against Churchill's line like a tide trying to wear down a cliff. But the cliff would not break. Churchill led from the front, appearing at the most dangerous point the moment it fractured. A machine gun burst pinned an entire platoon behind a rubble pile. Churchill ran across open ground, sword drawn, shouting at them to move. A sniper shot wounded an officer on the stairs of a collapsed house. Churchill climbed the wall, found the shooter's roost, and took the man prisoner at sword point. A German armored car pushed through the main street. Churchill grabbed a Piat team, pointed at a flanking approach, and helped them haul the launcher into position. He fought like a man, stitching together a battle with his bare hands. For 5 days, the Germans attacked. For 5 days, Churchill answered. But on the 6th night, everything changed. A German observation post had appeared on the hills above Molina, a vantage point that allowed them to direct artillery precisely onto the British positions. The Allies had to eliminate it. The attack would be suicide for a large force. But 2 men, 2 shadows in the night? That Churchill could work with. He chose 1 corporal, just 1. They moved after midnight, slipping through olive groves and stone terraces, crawling when necessary, freezing when patrols passed. The moon vanished behind clouds. The air held its breath. Churchill reached the first German position and saw the glow of cigarette soldiers relaxing, their rifles leaning against sandbags. Not alert, not expecting danger, certainly not expecting this. He walked out of the darkness with the broadsword in hand. The Germans stiffened, confused, unable to process what they were seeing. A British officer, calm, silent, holding a weapon older than their grandfathers. They surrendered instantly. Churchill bound them with their own belts, then used 1 prisoner as a decoy to approach the next position. It worked. Again and again. By dawn, he and the corporal were escorting 42 German prisoners down the path back toward the British lines. No shots fired. No alarms raised. 42 armed men captured by 2. It was impossible. It happened anyway. And among the prisoners, whispers spread, "This man cannot be real. This is a ghost, the kind our grandfathers warned us about." The legend sharpened. The capture of Molina tore a hole in the German advance. The beachhead held. The invasion survived. But more importantly, something intangible shifted. German soldiers began to fear that the stories were true, that the madman with the sword was out there somewhere, hunting them, watching them, waiting for the dark. Fear moved faster than bullets. It always does. And Jack Churchill knew exactly how to use it. Italy was supposed to be the end of Churchill's war, a brutal chapter closing after the madness of Sicily and the siege of Salerno. But the world had one more battlefield waiting for him. One darker, wilder, more broken than anything he had fought through so far. Yugoslavia, a land where mountains swallowed armies, where villages burned without warning, and where German occupation forces fought a war with no front lines, no rules, and no mercy. The British needed someone who could operate in that chaos, someone the enemy couldn't predict, someone who was, frankly, not built like ordinary men. They sent Churchill. When he arrived on the Adriatic island of Vis in the spring of 1944, the place looked less like a military base and more like a wound carved into the sea. The island was rugged, scarred by bombardment, and alive at night with the distant rumble of German artillery firing from the mainland. The partisans who greeted him were gaunt, armed with mismatched rifles and ancient pistols, hardened by years of fighting a war Britain barely understood. They stared at him, at the sword, at the bow, at the bagpipes tucked under one arm, at the eyes that looked not eager but ready. Churchill nodded politely. "You gentlemen seem to enjoy a good scrap," he said. The interpreter repeated it. The partisans erupted in laughter. They thought he was making a joke. He wasn't. The first operation came within days. A German outpost hidden in the mountains, fortified, watching the coastline, a thorn in the side of every partisan movement in the region. Churchill led the raid. The terrain was brutal. It twisted through cliffs, forests, and ravines no map properly captured. The partisans moved like shadows, silent and practiced. Churchill moved with them, keeping pace despite being twice the age of some fighters and carrying a sword that gleamed like a challenge to the mountain itself. At dawn, the group reached a ridge overlooking the outpost. German sentries paced below, rifles slung casually. They expected partisans. They expected mines. They expected ambushes. They did not expect Jack Churchill walking directly toward them with a sword in his hand. The first German froze, stunned by the apparition marching through the morning fog. Churchill didn't hesitate, he signaled, and the partisans struck with coordinated ferocity. The outpost fell within minutes. It wasn't the victory that shocked the partisans. It was the speed, the precision, the utter calmness of the British officer who treated the assault as if it were morning exercise. Whispers spread through the mountains that night. "This Englishman fights like an old hero from our stories. This one is not natural. The Germans fear him. We should follow him." Churchill didn't notice the admiration. He was already studying the next objective. The Germans, however, noticed him. Reports flowed through their intelligence channels. A British officer playing bagpipes in firefights, a swordsman leading raids in impossible terrain, a man who moved at night as if he could see through darkness. Some dismissed the stories as partisan exaggerations. Others, especially those who faced the raids firsthand, did not. They called him Der Geist, the Ghost, and they began to reinforce every outpost he approached. It didn't matter. Churchill adapted. Against fortified hills? He climbed cliffs no sane man would attempt. Against entrenched machine guns? He swung wide and struck from directions the Germans never bothered to defend. Against night patrols? He stalked them, learned their habits, and struck when the moon was high and the fear was highest. The partisans learned something from him that changed the course of their war. Fear can be a strategy, and Churchill was its master. Then came the order that changed everything. The island of Brach, held by several hundred German troops, fortified with machine guns, trenches, artillery positions, and a confidence forged by months of resisting partisan raids. Capturing it would require a larger force. British commandos, Yugoslav fighters, even elements of the Royal Navy. Churchill was placed in joint command. The partisans admired him. The British trusted him. The Germans didn't know he was coming. They would soon regret that. The landing on Brach went smoothly, too smoothly. The partisans froze. The plan called for an immediate attack before the Germans regrouped, but seeing the scale of the enemy fortifications, deep trenches, overlapping guns, hardened bunkers, their courage wavered. They halted on the beach, refusing to advance. Churchill was furious, though his voice didn't rise. He simply stared at the partisan officers, and for a moment, even the sea seemed to hold its breath. He couldn't force them. He needed them, and they would not move. So he waited through a long, maddening night as the Germans prepared. At dawn, he led the attack himself. The assault up the hill was a nightmare. Bullets chewed the dirt. Mortars shattered the rocks. The air trembled under the weight of explosions. But Churchill pushed forward, sword at his side, bagpipes somewhere behind him, until a mortar shell landed among the commandos gathered around him. Every man except Churchill fell. He alone remained standing, stunned but alive, his ears ringing, his pipes torn apart, his men dying around him. Then came the German advance. Shadows emerged from the smoke rifles raised, boots crunching across broken stone. Churchill reached for a weapon he knew he didn't have. No sword, no gun, no bow. Just himself. He sat down on a rock, lifted what remained of the bagpipes, and began to play. The tune, "Will Ye No Come Back Again," drifted across the hillside like a lament for the dead. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender. It was something deeper. Something the Germans didn't know how to interpret. They paused, too confused to fire, too astonished to act, too human to kill a man who played music for his fallen soldiers. A grenade blast ended the moment. Churchill was knocked unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. They transported him to the mainland, then to Germany, then to a special prison reserved for high-value hostages, men too important to execute, too dangerous to release. The guards whispered as he passed, "Is that him? The one with the sword? The ghost from Norway? From Sicily? From Yugoslavia?" They looked at him as if he were a myth that somehow walked into their barracks. But Churchill didn't care about legends. He cared about escape, because nothing the Germans could build, not a cell, not a fence, not a wall, could contain a man who never accepted the world on its own terms. And in Yugoslavia, he had learned something important. No one can imprison a ghost. Jack Churchill woke with a splitting pain behind his eyes and the metallic taste of blood on his tongue. The world swam into focus slowly, too slowly. A ceiling of rough-hewn timber, the sour smell of damp straw, chains clinking somewhere near his boots. Then the memory came back like a hammer. The hillside on Brach, the bodies of his men, the song, the grenade, the silence. He was not on a battlefield anymore. He was a prisoner. The Germans moved in between interrogation rooms like a specimen they weren't sure how to classify. His file confused them. His behavior confused them. His weapons confused them more than anything else. One officer held up Churchill's broadsword and stared at it with a bewilderment that bordered on offense. "Why do you carry this?" he demanded. Churchill shrugged. "Because it works." Too one-sided. It was the truth. But the Germans weren't prepared for truth delivered that simply. They questioned him about tactics, about Allied plans, about the British High Command. They thought a man named Churchill must be related to the Prime Minister. They thought this sword-wielding lunatic might be hiding a strategic mind beneath the eccentricity. He wasn't hiding anything. They simply couldn't understand him. And when they realized they'd get nothing of value, they sent him to a place designed to crush men harder than any interrogation room ever could. Sachsenhausen. Most prisoners arrived at Sachsenhausen broken. Churchill arrived irritated. The camp sprawled like a scar north of Berlin barbed wire. Guard towers, barracks arranged with geometric cruelty. Roll calls in the freezing wind. Guards whose eyes were dead behind the uniform. Prisoners who looked like ghosts long before they died. Churchill studied it all with the calm calculation of a man inspecting a poorly built machine. His first instinct wasn't fear. It was assessment. Where are the fences weakest? Where are the shadows deepest? When do the guards shift? Where does the earth run soft? Where could a tunnel begin? He wasn't asking if he could escape. He was asking how soon. They placed him in Zellenbau, a special compound for important prisoners, politicians, resistance leaders, officers with knowledge the Germans valued. The cells were isolated, but the restrictions created an unexpected advantage. Isolation meant access. Behind the barracks was a small gardening patch. The prisoners were allowed to tend supervised, but not watched closely enough. Churchill saw the garden once, and saw a tunnel every time he looked at it afterward. He began speaking with fellow prisoners quietly, carefully, choosing men who were not only desperate enough to try escaping, but disciplined enough to keep a secret. Among them were 3 RAF officers who had survived the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III. They had dug tunnels before. He had determination before. Together, they had a chance. Night after night, under the noses of bored SS guards, the prisoners dug. Not with shovels, those were tracked. Not with tools, tools were counted. With broken spoons, with hands raw and bleeding, with slivers of metal sharpened into improvised picks. They smuggled dirt into the compost heaps, used bits of cloth to reinforce tunnel walls, measured distance by counting heartbeats and breath intervals. Churchill's hands blistered, his fingernails tore, his knuckles split open, but he dug anyway. Not because escape was guaranteed, nothing in Sachsenhausen was guaranteed. Because captivity was impossible. He would not be caged. Not by fences, not by guards, not by a war. One night in September 1944, the tunnel was ready. It stretched more than 100 meters under the outer fence and emerged in a dark patch of forest beyond the camp. The prisoners gathered near the entrance in the garden, disguised beneath baskets of vegetables to hide their movement. Churchill dropped into the tunnel last. He pressed his palms against the cold earth, inhaled the stale, clay-scented air, and began crawling. For 10 minutes, he moved through darkness so complete it felt solid. For 10 minutes, the weight of the world pressed above him. Soil, fences, boots, guns. For 10 minutes, he was more animal than man. He emerged into the night soaked in sweat and dirt, but alive, free, in the most dangerous way possible. He whispered to the others, "North, mystery," and they ran. For 2 weeks, Churchill and squadron leader Bertram James, one of the RAF escapees, moved through northern Germany like wraiths. They slept in ditches, stole vegetables from fields, drank from cold streams that cut through the countryside like veins of silver. They avoided roads, farmhouses, even villages where lanterns flickered behind curtained windows. They walked at night, crawled when needed, breathed quietly, thought quickly, and every day, Churchill felt the weight of his sword missing at his side. When they finally reached the edge of the Baltic Sea, only a few kilometers from the shoreline, they believed the worst was behind them. But Germany, in 1944, was a nation drowning in paranoia. A patrol spotted them. Halt. 810s. Churchill and James froze. They had no papers, no disguises, no cover story. They were captured again. But the second captivity was different. The Germans now understood who they had recaptured, and they were terrified of losing him again. They sent him south deep into Austria, far from any advancing front line, far from any resistance network, far from anything that could help a man like Jack Churchill escape. The new camp was isolated, surrounded by mountains whose jagged peaks looked like the teeth of some ancient beast. The winter wind screamed through the valleys. Snow buried the ground in a white silence. The guards were nervous. The prisoners were hopeless. The war was collapsing. Churchill waited. He watched the guards, watched the mountains, watched the morale cracking like thin ice. And when the SS began moving the prisoners, 140 of them, toward the Tyrol region, intending to use them as hostages in a last-ditch attempt to negotiate with the Allies, Churchill recognized the opportunity, not in the guards, not in the march, in the chaos, because chaos had always been his element. When a German army unit arrived and confronted the SS, refusing to participate in the murder of the prisoners, the standoff ended with the SS withdrawing, leaving Churchill and the others stranded in a small Italian village, free but isolated. Most prisoners stayed, waited for Allied troops, prayed they would arrive before the SS returned. Churchill, standing amid the terrified crowd, looked south. South meant mountains, cold, exhaustion, danger, unknown territory, and Allied lines somewhere beyond all of it. "That way," he said. "Sir, you can't be serious," a prisoner whispered. Churchill tightened the remains of his tattered coat. "I've had enough of cages." "Number 5. He started walking. Nobody stopped him. For 8 days, he traveled alone. No map, no weapon, no food except what he scavenged. No rest except when his legs threatened to fold beneath him. The Alps did not welcome him. They cut him, froze him, nearly killed him. He climbed steep passes on torn boots, slid down rocky slopes slick with melting snow, followed streams where wolves had left fresh tracks, crossed valleys where abandoned farmhouses stood like bones picked clean by the war. His ankle throbbed, his ribs ached, his hands cracked open in the cold, but he walked anyway. On the 8th day, exhausted and gaunt, he limped into the outskirts of Verona and saw something he hadn't seen in nearly a year. An American armored car. The soldiers inside jumped, startled by the ragged man in a shredded uniform waving at them with the confidence of a general inspecting his troops. One American shouted, "Identify yourself." "He's Spectre." Churchill straightened as much as his battered body allowed. "Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill," he said. "No relation to the Prime Minister. Well, be ever prodigal." A pause. "And I would very much like a hot meal." 87. The Americans stared. Then one of them muttered, "Holy hell, it is him." They brought him in, fed him, gave him clean clothes, listened to stories that sounded impossible until they realized the man telling them had survived too much to be lying. Jack Churchill was home. He had escaped a concentration camp, escaped recapture, escaped the mountains, escaped death. But the war wasn't finished. Not for him. Japan was still fighting. The Pacific still burned. And Jack Churchill still had a sword waiting in his kit bag. Jack Churchill should have died 10 different times before he reached Allied lines in northern Italy. He didn't. Instead, he arrived looking like a ghost who refused to stay in the grave. The Americans who brought him in treated him with a mix of awe and disbelief. One of them, the sergeant who first approached him, later admitted he thought Churchill was some kind of hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. "Sir, you walked out of the Alps? Alone?" He was negatived. Churchill only nodded. He didn't explain how cold feels when it buries itself inside your bones. He didn't explain why he kept walking even when he could barely stand. He didn't explain that some men fear captivity more than death. He simply said, "It was time to go." It's Raldand. Within days, he was flown back to Britain. They tried to put him in a hospital. He refused. They tried to give him leave. He declined. He had spent too long in cages to tolerate being still. Movement was oxygen. Purpose was blood. And he had been denied both for nearly a year. He wanted back in the war. Not later. Not after rest. Now. So when the War Office asked him where he wanted to go next, he didn't hesitate. "Japan," he said. "The fighting isn't finished." The officer across from him blinked in disbelief. "Colonel, you've just escaped a concentration camp. And there's work left to do," Churchill interrupted. "Madness," the officer thought. But the kind of madness armies sometimes need. Within weeks, Jack Churchill was en route to the Far East. This time not in a cramped landing craft or a freezing Norwegian fjord, but aboard a transport aircraft slicing through the sky over India. The cockpit hummed. The engines droned. Maps rustled in the warm air. And Churchill, alive in the way only combat ever made him feel, studied everything the Allies knew about Japanese fortifications. Burma, Malaya, the Pacific Islands, caves, tunnels, fanatical resistance. This was a different enemy. A different war. A different battlefield where close combat wasn't a rarity, it was the rule. A war built for a man like him. His sword lay strapped in the kit beside his seat. Its weight steadied him. It felt like the story wasn't done yet, like he had one last chapter to write. But the world had other plans. Somewhere over India, the plane's crew received a coded message, a short one. One line, urgent enough that the co-pilot left the cockpit and tapped Churchill on the shoulder. "Sir, you need to hear this." "I will." Churchill looked up. The co-pilot swallowed. "An American bomber has dropped a new weapon on Japan. A very large weapon." "Well," Churchill raised an eyebrow. "What sort of weapon?" "Well, ideas." The co-pilot hesitated the way a man hesitates when describing something he doesn't understand. "They say it destroyed an entire city." "I could God." Silence. Not disbelief. Not horror. Just silence. As if the world had shifted under them. Churchill stared ahead for a long moment, processing a possibility he never imagined. "What city?" he asked. "Hiroshima." "Everyone." Churchill didn't speak again for the rest of the flight. 3 days later, another bomb fell. Nagasaki vanished in a flash hotter than the sun, and 6 days after that, Japan surrendered. The war was over. A war Churchill had survived through sword charges, arrows, cliffs, camps, and mountains, was gone in an instant. The plane he rode touched down in Burma, but the world he had been preparing for did not exist anymore. His chance to fight the Japanese, his chance to carry the sword into battle once more, had been erased, not by strategy, bravery, or sacrifice, but by physics, by a weapon so powerful that the old rules of war no longer mattered. When he disembarked, a junior officer approached with a clipboard. "Lieutenant Colonel Churchill, sir, your deployment has been cancelled. The fighting has ended." "Aye, suz." Churchill exhaled slowly. Not relief, not joy. Something closer to disappointment. The officer shifted uneasily. Orders say you'll be reassigned to administrative duties until further instruction." End quote. Administrative duties. For Jack Churchill, a man who surfed on the River Severn, a man who played bagpipes under machine gun fire, a man who captured 42 Germans with a sword, a man who walked out of a Nazi prison camp. Someone had actually written administrative duties next to his name. If war had a sense of humor, it was a cruel one. Years later, Churchill summed up his reaction in a single sentence that became part of his legend. "If it wasn't for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years. You want to eat shoe." It was a joke mostly, but buried inside, the humor was a truth he rarely admitted. Churchill didn't know how to exist without conflict. War challenged him. War focused him. War gave him a world drawn in sharp, simple lines. Courage on one side, cowardice on the other. Peace, by contrast, was a place where everything blurred, and now he had been dropped back into it. Without a sword charge to lead, without an impossible raid to plan, without an enemy to terrify. Still, Jack Churchill tried to fit himself back into the world. He wore the uniform, attended briefings, filed reports that felt like the opposite of oxygen. He served in Burma for a time mostly administrative, mostly dull. His superiors tolerated his eccentricities because men like him don't appear twice in one lifetime. But they had no idea what to do with a warrior built for a century that no longer existed. Britain was tired of fighting. The world was trying to rebuild. Everything was shifting toward diplomacy, stability, negotiation. The very things Churchill had never been interested in. He would stare out at the quiet jungles, listen to monsoon rains, hammer tin roofs, and feel something he hadn't felt once during 6 years of war. Restlessness, too much silence, too much stillness, too much time to think. The sword that had been his signature now hung unused. The longbow rested quietly. Even the bagpipes seemed out of place. He had become a warrior without a war. But history wasn't done with him yet. When Britain's colonial holdings began to fracture, when Palestine erupted into violence, when entire regions split along political, ethnic, and religious lines, Churchill found himself pulled once more into the orbit of conflict. Not the kind he loved. Not the kind where steel and courage settled everything, but the kind where one wrong decision could ignite 1,000 deaths. Churchill wasn't meant for those wars, but he would walk into them anyway, because men like him don't retire. They fade only when the world no longer needs their kind of fire. And the world, in 1947, was about to need him again, just not in the way he expected. The war in Europe was finished. The war in the Pacific was erased by nuclear fire. But the world Jack Churchill stepped back into was anything except peaceful. Empires were cracking at the seams, borders redrawn by men who had never touched the soil they divided. Old grievances surfaced like bones after a storm. And nowhere burned hotter than Palestine. To Churchill, Palestine felt like stepping into a different kind of battlefield, one where the enemy had no uniform, alliances shifted by the hour, and death came not from organized armies but from mobs, militias, and the sudden violence of a street corner. He had fought Germans. He had fought Italians. He had fought in mountains, in fjords, in jungles, in the ruins of Europe. But this was a different war entirely. A war of suspicion, a war of revenge, a war where even courage seemed to fracture. In February 1947, Churchill arrived as second in command of the 1st Battalion, Highland Light Infantry. The moment he stepped off the transport in Jerusalem, the air itself felt wrong, hotter, heavier, too still. Markets bustled behind sandbagged checkpoints. British patrols moved in armored lorries. Civilians pretended not to stare at every passing soldier. This was not a front line. This was a pressure cooker. Jewish refugees, scarred by the Holocaust, were pouring into the region seeking a homeland. Arab Palestinians feared displacement in their own land. Both saw the British as the obstacle standing in the way of survival. And British soldiers like Churchill were stuck in the middle, policing a land that was seconds away from tearing itself apart. It was the kind of duty he hated most. Rules, restrictions, politics, no clear enemy to charge, no strategic hillside to capture, no sword that could solve a problem with a single decisive strike. But Churchill had something more dangerous than a sword. He had presence, and presence matters where chaos boils. The streets were war in slow motion. Car bombs detonated outside cafes. Ambushes struck convoys at dusk. Gunfire echoed in alleyways, then vanished as quickly as it came. Armed groups on both sides carried out attacks, reprisals, counter-reprisals. British soldiers patrolled not to win a battle, but to delay a catastrophe. One day, Churchill's men were escorting Jewish medical workers. The next, they were negotiating with Arab elders, then responding to bombings, then retrieving bodies, then trying to stop the next revenge killing. Even for a man who had walked through gunfire with a sword, Palestine was unpredictable in a way no battlefield had ever been. But Churchill adapted. He walked into riots with the calm of someone defusing a bomb. He negotiated with men who carried knives under their shirts. He ordered his troops to lower their weapons when tempers flared, not raise them, because he understood something both sides forgot. Fear escalates, respect diffuse, and Churchill earned respect by refusing to show fear. That respect would define the moment that made his name in Palestine. The 13th of April 1948, a date etched in blood. A Jewish medical convoy, doctors, nurses, students, and patients, was making its way to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus, an area surrounded by Arab-held territory. British forces had escorted convoys before. But on that day, everything unraveled. Arab fighters ambushed the convoy with rifles and Molotov cocktails. The lead vehicles burned. Ambulances exploded. Gunfire echoed across the hillside for hours. British troops were nearby, close enough to hear the screams. But miscommunication, conflicting orders, and political pressure left them frozen at the worst possible time. When the shooting finally stopped, 77 civilians lay dead. The world would call it the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill did not witness the attack, but he inherited the consequences. Hadassah Hospital, perched atop Mount Scopus, was now isolated, stranded behind hostile lines, cut off from supplies, and surrounded by armed groups ready to finish what had begun. Hundreds of Jewish medical staff and patients were trapped. Someone had to get them out. Someone had to negotiate with every faction, Jewish, Arab, and British. Someone had to step into a no-man's land that wasn't marked on any map. That someone was Churchill. He approached the evacuation with the same cold precision he brought to raids in Norway, but diplomacy, unlike war, requires the kind of courage most soldiers never learn. Arab leaders expected threats. Jewish leaders expected promises. British officials expected compliance. Churchill offered none of these. He simply walked into each meeting with the same expression he wore when charging toward a machine gun nest, focused, direct, and utterly without fear. He convinced Arab commanders that harming doctors would destroy any credibility they had. He convinced Jewish leaders that delaying evacuation would cost more lives. He convinced British commanders that hesitation was unacceptable. Over 2 tense days, he coordinated one of the most delicate operations of the entire war. A ceasefire in a street with no rules, a corridor through territory where violence answered to no one, a convoy protected only by the calm authority of the man leading it. When the evacuation began, Churchill marched at the front, unarmed, uniform pressed, bagpipes left behind. A symbol, not a soldier. Gunmen watched from rooftops. Families peeked from shuttered windows. Everyone expected gunfire. None came. Under Churchill's direction, 700 doctors, students, and patients were escorted safely off the mountain. Not one shot fired. Not one life lost. It was the rarest kind of victory, a battle won by refusing to fight. When reporters later asked how he managed it, Churchill shrugged and said, "People are less likely to shoot at someone who's smiling." 1. It was classic Churchill, humorous, self-deprecating, deflecting attention. But the truth ran deeper. He didn't smile because he felt safe. He smiled because fear spreads. Calm spreads faster. And Churchill had always been a master of psychological warfare, even when the war required diplomacy instead of steel. Yet even in this moment of success, Churchill knew he didn't belong in this new world. He understood war. He understood fear. He understood chaos that obeyed a certain brutal logic. But Palestine was different. There were no fronts, no victories, no clean endings, only spirals, cycles, wounds that would not heal. When Britain announced its withdrawal in May 1948, Churchill boarded one of the final convoys leaving Jerusalem. Behind him, a new war erupted, one that would last long after every British boot had left the soil. For once, he did not look back. His war was finished. But his place in it, the proper place of a sword-wielding knight in an age of bombs, politics, and partitions, was fading. A man like Churchill didn't retire. He simply needed the world to tell him when his chapter was over. And Palestine, in smoke and fire, told him exactly that. Jack Churchill returned to Britain in the summer of 1948, a man carved out of a world that no longer existed. He had survived Dunkirk, Norway, Sicily, Italy, Yugoslavia, and a Nazi concentration camp. He had escaped through tunnels, surfed tidal bores, charged with swords, and played bagpipes under artillery fire. Now he stood on a quiet London street where the only sound was a bus engine and the rustle of newspapers in a vendor's stall. It felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. War had been a storm, he understood. Peace was a fog that swallowed him whole. The British Army tried to find a place for him. They needed his experience. They respected his legend. But the military he returned to wasn't the one he had left in 1939. The new army was neat, organized, administrative, full of men who had never heard a war cry in their lives. It was an army of forms, not fire. Churchill tried to fit inside it anyway. He taught commando, recruits young men who had grown up hearing stories about Mad Jack, unsure whether the legends were exaggerated or not. They learned quickly. While other instructors lectured, Churchill demonstrated. He waded into freezing rivers with his troops, scaled cliffs beside them, showed them how to read terrain with a glance, how to push their bodies farther than they thought possible. He demanded discipline without ever raising his voice. He demanded courage without ever belittling fear. His authority came not from rank, but from history, the kind of history carved into scars and earned in the smoke of battlefields across continents. But even here, something was missing. These young men would never storm a fjord at dawn, never cut through barbed wire while bagpipes wailed behind them, never fight an army in a way that felt mythic. Warfare had moved on. Technology had taken the place of audacity. Nations prepared for nuclear war instead of close combat. Battles were measured in megatons, not meters. A man with a sword had no role in that world, and Churchill felt it, not as bitterness, not as regret, but as a quiet, steady ache, the ache of a man built for a reality that refused to return. To combat the growing emptiness inside him, Churchill sought challenge elsewhere. He remained in uniform, served in training roles, and volunteered for duties simply because they were difficult. But danger was scarce, and excitement rarer still. One day he applied to parachute school not because he needed the qualification, but because he wanted to see if gravity still humbled him the way fear once did. He completed the course in his late 40s, landing harder than most young recruits, brushing dirt off his knees with a grin that startled the instructors. But even that thrill faded. He needed more. He needed something absurd, something dangerous, something no one else would try. He found it on a river. The River Severn hosted a phenomenon most Britons ignored: a tidal bore, a wave that barreled inland twice a day, muddy and unpredictable, capable of toppling boats and sweeping livestock into the current. To Churchill, it looked like a challenge. He built a surfboard in his workshop, a heavy wooden slab, more boat than board, dragged it to the riverbank, and waited. Local fishermen watched him with disbelief. "What exactly are ye plannin' to do?" one asked. "Ride it," Churchill replied, as if the answer were obvious. The wave arrived as a roar, a white crest racing upriver against the current. Churchill paddled straight into it. The fishermen shouted warnings. Churchill ignored them. The wave lifted him, carried him, pulled him upstream faster than a galloping horse. He surfed more than a mile before tumbling into the icy water, resurfacing with a grin no battlefield had ever seen. He had found briefly the sensation he had been chasing. Something worth fighting, something worth mastering, something that demanded courage. He returned to surf the Severn again and again, long before surfing became known in Britain. Locals called him eccentric. He called it exercise. He didn't need the world's understanding, only its resistance. Retirement eventually came in 1959. He accepted it with a shrug, as if stepping away from the military was no different from stepping off a train. In truth, it was the hardest transition of all. He tried normal hobbies, model boats, at first intricate naval replicas he crafted by hand. He sailed them on village ponds with the satisfaction of a man commanding tiny armadas. Then came steam launches, old riverboats he refurbished and piloted along the Thames, navigating locks and currents with a sailor's instinct. These hobbies amused him. But they were not a calling. People expected him to slow down. But Mad Jack Churchill was incapable of slowing anything, not thoughts, not feet, not life, which is why commuters on his daily train line routinely witnessed something extraordinary. As the train approached his stop, Churchill would stand, open a window, and throw his briefcase onto the tracks. Passengers stared in horror. They whispered that he had finally gone mad. Some even pulled the emergency cord the first time they saw it. But Churchill simply stepped off the train minutes later, strolled to the exact point where his garden bordered the tracks, and retrieved the case without a scratch. When asked why he did it, he said, "Why carry something when gravity will do the work for you?" Whenever one, it was nonsense. It was genius. It was Jack Churchill. His son Malcolm once said that his father talked openly about the war but never glorified himself. He didn't hide the fear. He didn't embellish the courage. He didn't pretend he was anything other than what he was, a man who was alive in chaos and patient in peace, only because he had no choice. Visitors expected bravado. They got humility. They expected exaggeration. They got stories told plainly, often with a laugh. But in those stories one could hear something deeper, a longing not for violence, nor victory, but relevance. Because the world had changed, the empire he fought for dissolved. The military modernized. Technology replaced the heroism of individuals with the strategy of machines. Churchill didn't dislike the progress. He simply didn't belong to it. He belonged to an era defined by audacity, by improvisation, by the idea that one man, in the right moment, could bend a battle with nothing but will. That era had passed. But Churchill hadn't. He lived on smiling, stubborn, unpredictable long after the world forgot how to make men like him. And eventually, time itself became the last opponent he could not defeat. If Jack Churchill's story moved you even a fraction as much as it moved us, then don't let it vanish into the quiet corners of forgotten history. Every like, every comment, every share tells the algorithm that these stories still matter, that courage and individuality still deserve a place in our modern world. So before you go, tell us one thing in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? And who is the Mad Jack in your own family, the person who refused to live life quietly? Your reply helps this channel reach more people who care about history that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. And it reminds the world that men like Jack Churchill weren't legends. They were real. If you haven't subscribed yet, join us. We're just getting started, and there are more forgotten stories worth saving.